want to consider is the mechanical structure of the timber, the aesthetic qualities, and the availability of that timber. So if it's a rainforest timber, obviously it's going to be something that might not be sustainable to log and therefore is not a good option for you. Some exotic species are difficult to come by as well. So the availability and size of planks or logs for the particular design that you're specifying, the density of the timber, so think about how durable you need it to be. Degradation over time and changes in color quality might be a factor for your consideration. What sort of temperature does the timber need to work within? Its exposure to the elements, resistance to infestation, these are all important considerations. Think about whether you need the wood to show grainy features or knots, its porosity, whether it's susceptible to twisting and bowing. Sometimes a lumber piece or a timber plank might have splits in it. This sometimes works as an advantage if you're trying to show a particular feature, but often it can represent that that particular plank may not have the structural quality that you need to ensure that whatever you're creating is going to last for a long period of time and take the weight of whatever it is that you're building for. So for instance, if a timber has dried very quickly, you might find that it splits or has checks in it. So it may not have been protected adequately when it was being dried, or it may have been dried too quickly in a kiln. Likewise, it may not be as strong as you need it to be. Sometimes you'll notice that a burr or a burl has occurred on a tree. So in this image, you can see a scar on a tree. In some cases, these are really highly prized as people like to put them on a lathe, turn them and create beautiful sort of artistic pieces or bowls or tables, or use burls as veneers on different structures. You might also consider the smell or odor from a particular type of species and whether you want that to be a lasting feature of your furniture item. The luster is something to think about. Is the timber meant to look rough sawn? Is it meant to be really shiny? And, is it a feature of your furniture piece to have the grain showing through? Or do you intend to paint or conceal the timber in some way? When selecting timber, always consider deforestation issues. The protection of native species is really important for you. Make sure that you have researched sustainability and whether the timber has been certified. Consider the substitution of tropical hardwoods or rainforest timbers for temperate hardwoods. So temperate hardwoods will often be certified. You need to just make sure that you do your homework. And salvage yards are a good source of recycled options, provided that you have checked that those salvage pieces are not affected by insects or rot, which could compromise the structural durability of your furniture pieces. So I've included some links throughout this lecture, as you can see, which you might want to dip into to get more information about timber selection or certification processes. Preparing your work. There's a lot of things to think about in terms of preparation. Safety is first and foremost the main consideration when working in a timber workshop. This includes wearing a dust mask, goggles, protecting hands, hair, feet, ears, skin. Protect your clothing, so make sure that you're wearing overalls or a lab jacket. Safety is something that I will constantly remind you of because it is imperative for our work in this particular studio. You not only have a responsibility to look after yourself, but you have responsibility for other people around you. So if you see someone that is working in an unsafe manner, you really need to either address it with them directly or come and see a technical officer or staff member so that we can help that person recognize what's going on. It is a good idea to always work with one other person in a workshop, so never conduct work on your own. If you're working at home, let someone know what you're doing so that they can come and help you if they haven't seen you for a while and want to check that you haven't been electrocuted, for instance. So work in well-ventilated areas, always with good lighting so that you can see what you're doing. Keep your area clean, especially when you're painting. It is so important to ensure that there's no dust around, and that protects your work and makes sure that you have a really beautiful piece at the end of the finishing process. Watch out if you're working with cables. Ideally, you should have a drop power plug in your workshop, but in reality, we often don't have that at home if we're working in a garage and so on. So it is important to think about how you wrap the cable around you over your arms or shoulders to make sure that they're not in the way when you're cutting through some heavy timber pieces. Be careful with any spillage, and this is why we don't have drinks in the workshop. You need to clean up any spills immediately. Even if you're working with some paint or glue and you've spilt something, let someone know so that they can add a barrier, make a warning sign, or just stand, near the spillage whilst you go and get a mop. So fire risks and chemical risks are possible. Just beware. It's just really important that we look after each other so that we can avoid serious injury. When you're selecting your timber or preparing your designed piece, the first thing that you're probably going to do is cut your timber in some way, or you're going to bring in a plank that's already been cut. Large trees are usually half cut first, and then they used to be quadrant cut, and this was known as quarter sawing. So you might hear the term quarter sawn timber, and it is the most prized timber after burls. However, quarter sawing takes a long time, and you will find that we don't really do it as much anymore because it's not as efficient as plain sawing or what's called through and through sawing. So here are some examples of the outcomes when we plain saw, quarter saw, rift saw, or live saw. This is just some of the terminology that you will come across, but the most common method that we see these days is what's called plain sawn timbers. If you purchase an antique piece of furniture, it may have been quarter sawn, and you will see the beautiful medulla rays of the timber grain showing through. So here is another example of plain sawn timber, and I've been to a lumber yard where they cut down the most magnificent logs into plain sawn pieces. I didn't witness any quarter sawing, but it is quite a sight to see the massive saws where the timber is milled. So if you ever get a chance to go out to a timber yard and witness the cutting of logs, it is both sad and impressive at the same time. Sad because using timber is a way of life, and obviously forests are affected. However, if the timber yard is following the chain of custody type of philosophy, is PEFC certified and follows FSC standards, then we can ensure that we're using sustainably sourced timbers. The drying process is really important when considering the timber that you purchase. So once the timber is cut, it may be end treated with a waxy paint to prevent rapid moisture loss. So it is important for the timber to dry. However, if it dries too quickly, it may result in some cracking, and that might not be what you're after. When the timber is sawn, initially the moisture content will be at around 30%, so the log is really quite heavy at this point in time. After cutting, the timber is stacked and each plank is separated to ensure that there's plenty of airflow traveling through. The timber is stacked usually on a pallet that will be either lifted by, some really heavy duty forklifts and trucks, but smaller timber yards will have smaller pallets. But it is important to note that stacked timber needs to be weighted properly. So you'll notice that on the image down the bottom here, all of the timber has been stacked really effectively. It's looked after, it's marked, so the consumer or the purchaser will know where it's come from, and it's a very clean way of dealing with the timber that's been processed. So the drying process, depending on the log size, can take from roughly 6 months for a small 100 millimeter log, in 100 millimeter in diameter, and it can take a couple of years depending on the size of the trunk. So a trunk from a large tree may take a couple of years to ensure that it is stable for working. Once it is air dried, depending on the needs of the customers and what the processes are in the timber yard, the timber might be dried even further using a kiln or a huge oven, as you can see on the top image there. And this reduces the moisture content even further to about 12 to 15%. Okay, and that type of timber is good to work with and it's considered reasonably stable.